Okay, welcome back. This is week 8 in a 16-week course, so you might figure out that that's time for the midterm exam. So, the way it works is everything is online, obviously, and we're going to cover the first half of the book, so chapters 1 through 7. I'm giving you a list of topics that are going to appear in the exam. And as I mentioned, this is not the actual question. This is just a list of topics for you to look at with page numbers and all so that you could study for the exam. Even though it's an open book quote, I know people, well, it's an open book test, I'm not going to study. Well, don't do that. Trust me, don't do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through the list and discuss them. And if you have any questions or something, you can fire me off a note. And we can kind of discuss them further. So, without further ado, I always wanted more ado. Come on. All right, here we go. All right, it's being pokey. Okay, so here we go. First, let's cover the rules. So, this is first 7 chapters in the book. And it is open book, open internet, open everything. I'm not restricting you in any way. But again, I'll caution you, I'll stop right here and caution you one more time. Just because it's open book doesn't mean that you're going to have the time to go look stuff up. This is still a timed quiz. Okay, so there's 40 questions in a pool of questions, but you're only going to get 25 of those to do. Well, plus 2 extra credits, so I guess you get 27. You have an hour and 15 minutes to do this, so if you're pretty good at the math, you can figure out, how many minutes and seconds that is that you can spend on each one of these exam questions, okay? So, 25 questions plus 2 extra credit. The system is going to pick these things in whatever order it wants. So, I have no control over which questions you get or what order they get. You may get a Chapter 4 question followed by a Chapter 1 question. I don't have any control. Cool. On the list is the chapter and page number that the topic is being talked about. Now that's really just to help you study. I am not saying that the question or the answer is found on that page. So don't say, okay, fiber optic is on page 55. Let me go there and find the answer. Well, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that's where the topic is discussed in the book. The answer might be on some other page. Got it? Okay, good. There's a column here for no. No in the book means either it wasn't adequately covered or perhaps wasn't covered at all, and therefore you have no choice but to rely on lecture notes. Cool. As always, about 20% of the material comes from me rather than the book, and it is timed, and you have an hour and 15 minutes to complete. So, let me just pick this example here, just for one, multiplexing. So the type of question you might expect to get in a question like this. Do you think maybe I'm going to have a question that says, please define the term multiplexing? Nah, that's probably not the kind of test question you're going to get. It is possible you would get a test question that says, explain how multiplexing solved a problem. A very good question would be, describe the problem that multiplexing fixed. See, that'd be the kind of question we're talking about, right? So it's going to be a why type question or explain the significance of multiplexing in this scenario, something. It's not going to be a definition of the terms. It's going to take higher brain power to be able to answer these questions. That's what we're all about. Okay, so let's just begin. So the first one is about multiplexing. So it could be one of those short answer things that basically says, explain what this means. It could be. Or it could be something a little bit more complex that says, how is this significant? Or what was the problem that existed? Something to do with multiplexing. The next one talks about switching. And in this particular chapter, right now, see, this is the cool part about it. If this question popped up, it'll say, 1-13 switching. So it gives you a context for the question, because switching, you may be thinking, oh, well, he's talking about something in layer 2. No, it's a chapter 1 question So clearly it's not something dealing with, Ethernet switch or hub or something. So chapter 1 switching was all about circuit switching versus packet switching. Remember all that good stuff? And the analogy that we used was the phone system, right? How it used to be all circuit switch. Well, actually, it used to be manually switched with plug board. And then it became, just a mechanical switching system. And then we finally got to the point where practically all of the communications are packet switched. So it's that kind of switching that we're talking about. And the question may have something to do with like the phone system, as an example. The next one talks about the internet traffic, and we're talking, because this is a chapter 1 kind of question. We're talking about the nature of internet traffic, the fact that it kind of operates in bursts and it's kind of asymmetrical, meaning most of the traffic is down to my computer and very little of the traffic is going up, that kind of stuff. So bursty in nature and all those things. Okay, cool. That's what that's all about. The next one just talks about the OSI layers, and so yes, I kind of expect you to have that committed to memory. I'm sorry, that's one of the few things that I'm going to kind of have to insist that you memorize. Yes, you need to know the 7 layers of the OSI model. Maybe you can use that cool little mnemonic to remember it all, but yeah, you need to know those guys. The next one talks about protocol, and what's a good definition of protocol? Might actually be a good question. But it might be talking about what happens if I don't use a protocol. That'd be a even better question. If this protocol doesn't match that protocol, what happens? That kind of thing. So issues, and these are, chapter 1s are almost all high altitude questions. There's no down into the weeds yet. So this is just talking about protocols in general. So next we switch over to chapter 2. Remember, chapter 2 is all about layer 1, right? Most of the chapters from this point on are kind of layered, following the OSI model. So what are the functions of layer 1? And remember, layer 1 is that physical layer, and so what all does it do? It could be one of those short answer kind of questions. It could be one of those multiple choice things. Could be what's called a multiple answer. Which of the following are true of the functions of layer 1? And you go through yes, no, yes, no, that kind of thing. The next one talks about guided media. And I put a no in here on purpose because the book didn't cover this topic very well at all. But I did in lecture, and it is in the lecture notes, about what is guided media and why. And so I may give you some example and say, is this an example of guided or not? That'd be a good question. The next one talks about unshielded twisted pair, UTP, wiring. Remember how most all of the UDP is 8 wires, and then some of these wires get used for transmitting and some of them get used for receiving and all that kind of stuff. And so this one is not really technically deep in the weeds, but I may ask you something about the use of the pairs and how many there are and that kind of stuff. The next one talks about bandwidth, and this is going to be one of those things where this is one of those definition of term kind of things. It won't be quite that simple, but it'll probably want to be one of those that basically says, like, what's the difference between bandwidth and something else? Because bandwidth is typically used incorrectly, and so I may ask you, what's the context for it being used incorrectly? Give me an example where bandwidth. I got broadband internet service. What does that mean? Well, nothing. The marketeers have taken over. So I'm going to ask you something about bandwidth and what that really means. The next one talks about character encoding. Remember, in layer 1, one of the things we have to do is to bust up things so that they're suitable to making them show up on a wire. And so we remember you did a paper on this. Character encoding, like ASCII and all that stuff. Okay, good. The data link function. So now we're into chapter 3. And so chapter 3 is all about, remember, layer 2. And so now I need to impose some order and structure on the data before I can pass it down to layer 1. All that good stuff, that's what we're talking about. This next one talks about the practical, the carrier sense, multiple access, collision detection thing. And I may ask you what's wrong with this, what the limitations are. It may be one of those things that talk about, what the standard says you can do this, but what's the practical limit here? And so I could almost put an asterisk by this somewhere that says this is kind of one that's in the weeds. I'm going to tell you which ones are in the weeds. There's not many of them. There's 3 of them. This is one that's kind of in the weeds, where you're going to have to go through the lecture notes and find this, okay? And it may be not something that you would remember on your own, but you'd have to look up. Okay, cool. The next one talks about the CRC, and we had an awful lot of discussion about why checksum alone didn't work well and how CRC was better. And so comparing checksum algorithm to CRC algorithm in the context of layer 2, which one is better and why? In what scenario does one work better or worse? That's the kind of question. The Ethernet header. I spend, one of the questions we had on a recent quiz had to do with the IP header, and a lot of people didn't read that well. So yes, this is about the structure of the IP header. I don't know how to make that any more clear. It's about the structure of the IP header. Okay. All right. I may pick a particular field out of that header and say, what does this mean? That kind of thing. Okay, cool. The next one talks about MAC address. And so we talked about how, the MAC address is assigned to manufacturers, and so it's split in 2. So, 3 bytes belong to the manufacturer and 3 bytes belong to, the serial number. So together, that kind of stuff. So something about how MAC addresses look or act or are assigned or that kind of thing. The next one talks about loops. So in layer 3, we talked about what happens if I have, a layer 2 switch that is plugged into another layer 2 switch and it creates a loop. What kind of disaster does that create, or what kind of opportunities does that create? That's a good question. Now we're in chapter 4. We're talking about IP addressing. So what are the rules for IP addresses? And I'm not going to go into too much of the weeds of class A addresses start at this number and end at this number. No, not that kind of stuff. But just the big picture on what are the rules for IP addressing. Well, they have to have this, and they have to have this, and they have to have that kind of stuff. Just what are the rules? The next one talks about routing responsibility. Who has what kind of responsibility? What responsibility does a PC have? What responsibility does a router have? What responsibility does layer 2 have? Layer 3, layer 4? Just who has responsibilities to do routing? The next one talks about layer 3. So this is kind of sort of similar between routing responsibilities and L3 responsibilities. Now, in addition to routing, right, L3 does other things. Okay, it's not just for routing. There's other things that it does. If you can remember what that is, that'd be a good answer to that question. The next one talks about the IP header. Again, this is one of those things where I don't know how to make it any more clear. I'm talking about the structure of the IP header. Okay? Again, I don't know how to make it any more clear. I may pick out a particular field and say, what is this? I may have a question that's more generic. It talks about just the morphology. What does it look like? And why does it look the way it does? That kind of stuff. Some of this may actually be even a repeat from a previous chapter. It's quite possible. Cedar or cider, depending on how you pronounce it, is the next one. And I may ask you some questions about, how I can move that dividing line between the network part and the host part. How many degrees of freedom do I have, for example? Can I move it in chunks of 4 or 8, whatever that is? This is probably a good place to stop for the 15-minute mark. We'll polish this off in just a few more minutes.